Everyone. Now, as pretty much all of you know, Richard Dawkins is famously known for being one of the most successful popularizers of the new atheism, and in our circles, of course, has been pretty much entirely dismissed and discredited for putting forth probably the worst and most shallow arguments against Christianity and theism in general. But what is not well known about him is that, he's actually a clandestine classical theist. Okay, maybe not quite, but what I do want to show in this video is that his most famous attempted argument against the existence of God, if you actually follow it through to its logical conclusion, can actually be interpreted as, a pretty airtight argument for the existence of God as classically conceived. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? And this has also happened with The Amazing Atheist. Maybe we'll do a separate video on that subject. But it's not all too uncommon. They often fall into these trains of thought that actually lead to theistic conclusions, and it's not talked about all that much. But before we get into that, remember to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to get a notification when I go live or upload a video. And also, if you want to support what I do, it helps out a lot, helps me keep doing what I do, please consider becoming a patron or maybe a channel member. You can see the Patreon details in the description. They get all kinds of things. You get Q&A access. If you have a question, a theological question, a philosophical question, you want to know my thought on something, I basically make myself available to you at your convenience, and I try to get back to you as soon as I can. And if I don't know the full answer, I'll at least point you in the right direction. So that's one thing. Video requests, book recommendations, like monthly book recommendations, articles, exclusive streams on a periodic basis. So it's I would say it's a pretty decent package. Okay, so on to the meat of this video. We should first start off, I think, with Dawkins's actual argument. And, essentially it boils down to the claim that, in order to account for the complexity of the universe, the complexity of the physical universe, it really doesn't make sense to appeal ultimately to a reality that must itself be complex. And so on his view, there has to be if there's going to be an intelligible explanation for the origin of all things, it's going to have to arise out of a source or a cause, maybe in his view, a nexus of causes. That's the opposite of complex, and namely simple. And he explains this kind of along Darwinian lines. But let's let Dawkins actually explain himself here.
As somebody who's deeply steeped in evolution, I am kind of in love with the idea that it's possible to explain complex things in terms of simple things, and that's foreign to normal human nature. It's a difficult thing for humans to grasp, and Darwin's great gift to us, I think, is to show that big complex things can come into existence by an explicable, understandable, beautiful, elegant process of gradual evolutionary change. And that's such a beautiful idea that inventing a big complex thing, which God must be if he exists, throws a ruddy great spanner in the whole works of the beauty of that Darwinian concept of
you.
Okay, so he's articulated this idea in all sorts of different ways. He talked about it before the Archbishop of Canterbury, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He's articulated it in different ways, but he always does go back to this idea that complexity has to arise from simplicity. And so why do I say that this is actually an argument in favor of the existence of God? Well, if his instinct here is correct, then, it would logically follow that the only way to account for complex realities would be to turn to simpler realities, since complexity cannot account for complexity. And this is actually an insight shared by classical philosophers and metaphysicians. To speak in maybe Platonian terms, the one, for example, cannot proceed out of the many, but the many must proceed from the one. And so Dawkins is absolutely correct here. The problem is, however, he hasn't studied theology or philosophy enough to realize that this is the precise insight that leads to the most airtight arguments for God's existence ever put forth by theologians and philosophers. And while it is true that, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas and others argue for God's existence through change, causality, contingency, etc., the only way that they really are able to get at how the first cause is characteristically divine is through nothing other than the simplicity of the first cause. That the first cause is not composed of physical or metaphysical parts, but is none other than the pure and simple act of being itself, unrestricted, unlimited, uncircumscribed, and wholly one. This is the bedrock of classical theology, and it's the key through which we can fully understand how all of the rest of the divine attributes derive from this conception of the first cause. Because he is non-composite, he is able to exist through the sheer power of his own essence. His essence is none other than existence. He's able to wholly transcend all things other than himself. He's not even an individuated what or a big self, but is none other than the fullness of being itself, in and through whom all things participate for their reception of being. And so, far from challenging theistic mindsets, Dawkins' insight here is a pretty decent, albeit imperfectly expressed, testimony to the baseline, I would say, theistic intuitions that undergird our most immediate perceptions of reality. Now, to answer the objection that inevitably comes next, and he actually has articulated this objection, that God can't be simple, given the myriad of activities that he undertakes in his providential care over creation, I think this comes from a fundamentally erroneous way of thinking about simplicity altogether. Simplicity should not be understood in terms of being less potent or more narrow in one's scope of powers or activities. It's actually the exact opposite. Complexity and structure only arises as a result of being limited in one's ability to bring about an effect from one's causal activity. And to fully understand this relationship between complexity and simplicity, you really have to know a little bit about classical metaphysics, about how it works in classical metaphysics, this relationship. And so to understand this a little bit, I'll kind of explain it in the following way. It is only by virtue of the relative simplicity of a thing's form, which is the principle by which the thing is intelligible. So it's only by virtue of the relative simplicity of the thing's form that the whole substance of the thing is able to perform activities that are able to be discerned as that substance's activities. I'll say that again. It's only by virtue of the simplicity of the form of a substance that the whole substance can perform activities that are able to be discerned as belonging to that substance. It's the source of the integral unity of the substance itself, the integral unity of the thing. That's because it is the simplicity of the thing, it's the simplicity of the form of the thing that accounts for its unity. And it is that thing's unity, that integral unity, by which we can distinguish this thing from that thing, which actually organizes and orders all of the constituent parts that make up that thing. And in fact, it's the unity of the substance, our ability to identify it as one integral, unified reality. It's that unity of the thing's substance that in fact causes those parts that make it up to actually constitute the thing in question as a unified thing. So take, for example, like the human body. I know that got a bit abstract, but take, for example, the human body. No doubt the human body is very complex, and it's made up of countless constitutive parts that make it up. But each and every one of those parts, they only derive their intelligibility and principle of organization from the nature of what it means to be human in the first place. And this integral unity of the form of humanity is distinguished from the parts that make up the human person, through the simplicity of that form. So while the human body, of course, needs to be complex in order to carry out all the functions proper to humanity, this is only because the human person is really limited by materiality and being immersed in matter. In point of fact, the higher nobility of our human capacities, it doesn't derive from the complexity of the parts that make up our organs, but it really derives from the formal principle that orders those parts toward a definitive end. That's not only true of humanity, by the way, but it applies to all material substances. Each material substance derives its intelligibility and purpose from its formal principle, which is an irreducible whole. We wouldn't have, for example, like going back to the human body, you wouldn't be able to understand what a leg is or an arm is or what neurons are without that organizing principle of what determines the order of all of these parts to begin with, namely humanity itself, the unified organism, the unified reality, the oneness of the organism, the wholeness of the organism. And so wholeness, therefore, precedes the parts through which this wholeness is communicated through the substance and in the physical world. That's really the key. And by the way, a lot of philosophers of scientists are coming to this conclusion that wholeness precedes complexity. Wholeness, irreducible wholeness, is kind of the key through which we can understand a lot of biological realities in the world. You should look it up, the science of wholeness, of irreducible wholes. And that's really an insight about metaphysical simplicity. So, therefore, not only does Dawkins' argument inadvertently prove the existence of God by requiring complexity to arrive out of absolute simplicity, his preemptive counter-argument is answered ahead of time when one simply gains a proper understanding of what metaphysical simplicity even is in the first place and what it actually entails. So, Dawkins' instinct about the improbability, and in actuality the impossibility, of a complex God to account for the complexity of the physical universe, I would say that remains apt and sensible, despite himself. The only problem is he doesn't go radical enough, actually. He doesn't follow through to the end of what his instinct logically would entail. Not only does that instinct lead to a theistic conclusion, I would argue it leads to the most comprehensive understanding of what is most characteristically divine about God, namely the absolute simplicity of his self-subsisting act of existence, the divine act of existence. So that was just kind of a short little reflection. Hope you enjoyed that. If you like this video, like I said, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. It helps the algorithm a lot. Comment. That also helps the algorithm. And I like to hear what you think. I like to interact with the comments. So comment what you think. Like I said, if you want to support what I do, check out my Patreon, or you can become a channel member. You get a lot of the similar perks through that as well. And God bless all of you.